So thank you, Kenny. Thank you all for attending. As a paleobiologist, I study the evolution of life. I'm particularly interested in dinosaurs, mass extinctions, these kinds of things. And so I'll be talking today about extinctions. Okay, so the title links extinctions in the past with survival and evolution on a large scale. So I want to try and connect these different aspects of the history of life in a way that I hope you will find useful. It's based on a book that I've just written, published by Thames and Hudson, New York, published and available throughout the States. And it has 15 stories that bring you right up to date on everything we know about extinction in the past and through to the present. And it's a subject that we care about. I think a lot of people care about because it's, in fact, part of this big theme of biodiversity, the wonder of life on Earth, the reason that people watch those fantastic wildlife documentaries, that people like to travel and see the world. And we want to understand not only the origins of the biodiversity we see today, but how that has been affected by extinction in the past. And of course, it starts from the observation that species don't last forever. As a rough rule of thumb, any species that we could recognize on the Earth today, probably including human beings, Homo sapiens, lasts for about 1 million years, meaning there is extinction. Species go extinct, they replace each other. And this is part of the debate about whether this happens in a gradual way on the left, where species are evolving continuously and changing in a stepwise manner, or a punctuated equilibrium, where it happens as more discrete events, that species go on very unchanged for quite a long time, and then at some point, for some reason, perhaps an environmental change, there's a rapid event of speciation where one species splits into two. Now, we know through the history of life, the history of the Earth, there have been many so-called extinction events. These are times when lots of extinction is happening, usually because there's a big environmental crisis, which maybe makes temperatures, world temperatures, much colder or much hotter than normal. And organisms are very tuned, plants and animals are very tuned to living in their preferred climate zone. And if you perturb that in a big way, life doesn't like it and species disappear. And this graph shows over the last 500 million years, the spikes all indicate times of high extinction. And some of them are labeled with a name, End-Permian, End-Cretaceous. These are the big 5 mass extinctions. And we talk about these 5 indicated with red arrows. And it's because of these big 5 that we document, that paleontologists document. And the final one at the end of the Cretaceous, of course, was the famous one when the dinosaurs disappeared. And it's because of these big 5 that sometimes people talk about the present crisis as the 6th mass extinction. But don't we need a time machine to see what was going on? And this is a very core question that as teachers, we often are asked. And I'll give you an answer. I will say, no, we do not need a time machine. We actually know a lot from the existing evidence. Let me show you. So, for example, here are some key questions about the end of the dinosaurs, this last of the big 5 events. Was it a meteorite impact or was it volcanism? What were the consequences? Did it happen in June? The answer is yes, I'll show you. Is it all guesswork, or how can we test hypotheses about what was going on? And so first of all, evidence for impact. The classic story dates back to 1980, when Luis Alvarez on the left and his son Walter Alvarez made observations in Europe, where they identified evidence for a so-called iridium spike, shown on the right. And this enhancement of iridium told them that there was a sudden arrival very rapidly of a great deal of material from space, an extraterrestrial source, because iridium generally arrives on the Earth's surface from space in the form of tektites, which are small meteorites. They found the spike exactly at the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, KPG, and they interpreted that as evidence for a massive impact. And they published this formula, which I won't linger over, but it's in the talk and you can have a look at it later. It enabled a simple, an arithmetical calculation of the size of the meteorite that had hit the Earth, that had sent up this vast dust cloud containing the iridium, which was derived from the meteorite, the asteroid itself. And the calculation reflects the surface area of the sphere representing the outer atmosphere. And you had to develop a thickness of dust containing the iridium sufficient to black out the sun. With that knowledge, you can back calculate the mass of the asteroid and hence the diameter. And they came up with something like 7 miles, 10-kilometer diameter. After that, they only had the iridium anomaly, number one. In the following 10 years, geologists and paleontologists established a whole sequence of additional evidence for impact, including all of these features. Shocked quartz, shown at the top right, is a high pressure manifestation of the mineral quartz, can only be produced on impact. It was found abundantly in many locations. Glassy spherules, number 4, is shown on the bottom left. These are thrown out, these can be thrown out by volcanoes, but in which case they have the chemistry of volcanic lava. Whereas in the case of the impact at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, they have the chemistry of limestone and evaporite salts, indicating a non-volcanic impact kind of source. And subsequently, as many of you will know, the crater was identified at Chicxulub in the Yucatan Peninsula. And there is a map showing what the Caribbean looked like at the end of the Cretaceous. Sea levels were 100 or 200 meters higher. So although the crater now lies part under the ocean, part under land, at that time, it was entirely in the ocean. Hence, the melt products from that impact crater reflect the sediments on the seafloor. They're nothing to do with any kind of volcanic lava, but they're much more about limestone and evaporites and so on. And the geophysical trace of this crater, the reason it's not easy to see the crater is that it has been buried under 66 million years of accumulated sediment. And so the only way to detect the crater is either by cenotes, which mark the boundary of it. You can look at the map, and there's a sort of ring of these marking the edge of the crater, but also in more detail, geophysical imaging, as shown here. And guess what? Alvarez and colleagues got the size absolutely right. A 10-kilometer asteroid makes a crater that's about 100 to 200 kilometers across, and that's what it was. So that was a fantastic bit of science, very little evidence, very smart calculations, and they got it right. But what about volcanoes? Because indeed there were big volcanic eruptions happening at just that same time. And these are represented by what are called the Deccan traps in India. These are great thicknesses of basalt lava. And if you look at the world map, it shows in red areas of these large igneous provinces, as they are called. There's a big one in Russia, which we'll come back to. The one in India, the Deccan traps, is shown in red, and the trail of red behind it traces the drift of India as it moved across the location of the Seychelles, which is where it was at the end of the Cretaceous. It was an island, and then it moved north and docked with Asia. But so why would we not regard these volcanic eruptions as having caused the extinction? Because as we'll see later, massive volcanic eruption has been a major cause of extinction in the past. So here is the test. This is where we show the first of the scientific tests, where you don't need a time machine. So in this case, Chelly Hull, who's based at Yale, she and a team of researchers decided to tackle this a couple of years ago because it was up in the air. Was it volcanic eruptions? Was it impact? So the only thing you need to know is that an impact causes cooling, because the idea of the impact is if it's going to cause extinction, this is through the dust cloud. And the dust cloud not only, of course, removes daylight by blanking out the sun, it also removes heat because the sun gives us heat and light. And so you expect, following a massive impact, that you will have cooling. Temperatures fall. Whereas in the case of massive volcanic eruption, all of the effects are contribute to warming. You get global warming because what causes the global effect from the volcano is the production of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. And so volcanoes give warming associated with extinction. Impacts give cooling associated with extinction. So what Shelley Hull and her team found was, shown at the top right, is a trace through time, through geologic time. You can see the Cretaceous and the Paleogene are marked. The KPG boundary is shown by that vertical red line, and the age relative to the boundary is shown as negative before and positive after. So here we are using, measuring ancient temperatures in the oceans, tracking from left to right. We go along at 0 level, and then it rises at minus 0.2 million years, minus 200,000 years. There's a substantial rise in temperature. And then it drops towards the KPG boundary, and there's a little dip in temperature, and then it carries on afterwards. So QED, problem solved. The volcanic eruptions are causing global warming before the extinction event, 200,000 years before. The boundary, the KPG boundary, is associated with cooling, associated with the impact. And so the problem has been resolved based upon fantastic quality data. And you may be surprised at that capability of dating the rocks, that it's possible now to discriminate not only millions of years, but actually tens and hundreds of thousands of years. But this is one of the great things about science, as we all know. It gets better and better. When I was young, we couldn't have done this. Now we can. And so I would argue this is a case where we have scientific evidence, we have a hypothesis that has been tested, it's capable of refutation. If somebody doesn't like this paper, they say, no, you got this wrong. They can go back to the data and produce another independent curve of temperature through time. If they don't like the dating, they can check all of that and say, no, you got it wrong. We'll test all of this dating. And they may prove it's totally wrong. But the chances are, I think, this big team got it right. And I would argue this is scientific because it's capable of being refuted. You can go out and challenge it with data. What about June, the killing day? This slide encompasses a lot. What we have at the top is a fluorescence image. You can see the scale bar showing the gill bars of a sturgeon or a paddlefish from sediments that are dated as the very last day of the Cretaceous. So there's a big claim here. This is from a famous location in South Dakota called Tanis. It documents the Hell Creek Formation, which is one of these Cretaceous age geologic formations in the Midwest of the United States, which documents dinosaurs and all sorts of other fossils all the way through to the end of the Cretaceous. The great thing about that photograph is that you're looking at a fish with modern relatives, paddlefish and sturgeons. They're big fish. They live in fresh waters today in the United States. They lived in fresh waters at the end of the Cretaceous. So we've got a direct biological comparison to help us to identify the species, its mode of life, all kinds of other stuff. The green objects, the blue objects are the gill bars. They're the bones. The green objects are glassy spherules from Chicxulub, thrown 2,000 miles from Mexico to North Dakota. And the reason that we know that these connect with Chicxulub is they have got exactly the chemistry of those melt spherules that are documented around the Caribbean. So this is claimed to be the last day of the Cretaceous. And some of you may have seen the David Attenborough documentary with, I think it had that name, The Last Day of the Dinosaurs. So that's the start. Now, the next thing that was done was to look at the growth rings within the bones of these fish. And remember, the paddlefish and sturgeons have got living relatives, so we can interpret them in light of the living relatives. So on the right, the photograph with the red arrows see if I can actually make this. I'm not sure if I can make this into a laser pointer. I'll just try. Yes, I think I can. Here we go. Let's see if this works. Yes. So reading from right to left in the photograph labeled C, we're looking at growth rings in the bone that we can see in the photograph. And the growth rings are highlighted. The arrows indicate years. So every winter, growth slows down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this fish was 7 years old when it died. And we know that this is what the bone looks like because we have the modern representatives: fast growth in summer, pale colored; slow growth in winter, dark colored. So this thing didn't die in winter, it died in spring, because the outer edge of the bone, which is rounded, but you can see the bones at the top there, it shows it went beyond winter, counting out the months, maybe March, April, May, June. It died in early June. They repeated it many times with many different fish bones from different individual fish, different species of fish. Some of them died at 5 years old, some were 6, some were 7, some were 3. In every case, they count 3 or 4, 3.5 months after winter. QED. The impact happened in June. If you don't like that, you can find another locality, you can look at a different species, you could look at the crocodiles or look at some other fossils, look at the turtles, the mammals. There we go. Interesting. Oh, and the other thing about this slide, I often like to show pictures of the people who do the research. There they are. And so if kids are asking, what does a scientist look like? You can say, this is what scientists look like. Here's a couple. So extinction today. So I'm trying to link, we're jumping from past to present. The reason I wanted to feature those two studies was to show you the nature of the evidence and the way we connect back and forwards to the present day. We justify, we can interpret, we can keep referring to the present day. And I think in both cases, I hope I've shown that the evidence is there. This is not guesswork. This is not arm waving. This is testable evidence. And I think if you follow the line of reasoning, or you could call it a chain of inference. So for example, that story I told with the bones and the growth rings and how they're cross-checked against the present day, you could lay that out as a chain of inference with 2 or 3 observations, interpretations based on modern data, and then a kind of inevitable outcome. And it can be tested and retested, because in this case, you can, at the moment that maybe only half a dozen specimens have been examined, you can look at more and more and more and see whether they corroborate or not. So it's never proved, of course, but it's testable. So what about extinctions today? So I'll hop through this fairly quickly because, of course, there's a whole field. There are textbooks, there are many articles. We all know about the fact that humans cause extinctions. And there are famous cases, of course, that have been well documented. There's the great auk at the bottom right. I could have shown the dodo. I could have shown the passenger pigeon. I could have shown the New Zealand moa. Many examples. Well, those are birds, but there are plenty of others from other groups. And we also know stories like the story of DDT and how humans were misled by their chutzpah in thinking this is a miracle agent that we can use to improve agriculture, and then, oh dear, look at the side effects of DDT. But nonetheless, we worked it out, and science created a bad situation, it could be argued, but in the end, science resolved it. But how are we killing life? And so there was a very good review in Nature 10 years ago by science journalist, I forget his first name, Monastersky. And I'll be showing a few images from that. I was looking for something more recent, and I'm sure there are plenty of reports and others that would bring this up to date. But the 2 main reasons that species are going extinct today are exploitation and habitat degradation. So that includes fishing and other ways of harvesting wild food, but also, of course, habitat degradation, the conversion of Amazonian rainforest into farmland inevitably causes extinction. And how much extinction and how much biodiversity, both of these are difficult to estimate. But without reading the full detail of the slide, I think many people would argue at the present day, it's a handy figure to remember. There are something like 10 million species of macroscopic plants and animals and fungi. So that's not including microbes. And 10 million is a useful figure. And also, how many extinctions? Well, that can be calculated based on historical figures, so known extinctions like the great auk, the dodo, other cases. Monastersky gives a summary shown on the right of numbers of known extinctions. It's only 765 out of those 10 million. But of course, the ones that we can document are the ones that have been studied in detail. So they tend to be birds and mammals and a few other groups. We're not very knowledgeable, though, about insects or marine organisms. So there's whole areas we're just not really confident about. And nonetheless, we can use those known extinctions to give us some kind of indication of how many extinctions are actually happening. Because, of course, using figures I gave you already, if a species typically lasts for 1 million years, and there are 10 million species on Earth, we would, in the natural way of things, we would expect 1 extinction per year. 1 extinction per year. That's, you can work that out. Of course, it's a nice calculation to get kids to think about. If you take those figures of known extinctions, though, you get quite a high figure, something like 30,000 species lost per annum. That's a very big number. And that's where Al Gore got his number of 78 or 80 species lost every day. And that is evidence-based, because that's based upon those figures of numbers of mammals. If we know there are, I don't know, let's say birds, 10,000 species of birds on Earth today, we know the rate of loss, 2 or 3 species a year of birds being killed by one reason or another. You can then scale that up to the 10 million species of all living things. But I think most people would agree that's probably an overestimate. And so the range of figures are anything from 10 species per week, and I can't quite read this because I've got, let's see if I can reduce this. Yeah, anything from 10 to 700 species per week. The 700 per week probably is the 30,000 per year. And so that's the range. Even so, it's much more than the natural rate. Remember, the natural rate is 1 species per year. So even the lower estimate of 10 per week is 500 per 500 species per year. So that's, even at the lowest and most conservative estimate, is way more than the natural level. So whatever it is we're doing, whatever is happening on the current Earth, the rate of extinction is quite a lot higher than it ought to be. Let me see. Yeah, here we go. Making a link to the past, I can draw your attention. The kids love this. This is huge fun. De-extinction. I won't talk much about this. This is a whole lecture on its own. De-extinction is, can we bring them back to life? You can either modify human behavior so that we respect the wild a bit better than we do, or de-extinction, bring them back to life. I advise you to look at the website of the colossal company based in Texas, where else? And they are facing the challenge. They're going to bring the mammoth back to life. I won't say any more about it. It is possible, it is feasible. What they're doing by genetic engineering will doubtless work. It's a fantastic and exciting program. I would only, and they don't claim, nor would I wish to claim, that this is actually a realistic way of bringing species back big time. You can bring the odd one back here and there, perhaps. And there, if you've seen any of the Jurassic Park films, you might also think, would it be a good thing to bring all those species back? That's another question. Let me pick up another story. We've explored a couple of topics, and I'll sort of draw these all together. But let's have a look at the biggest extinction of all time, which is the End-Permian event. This is one I've worked on, so I want to just talk about this a little. It's less well known than the End-Cretaceous because it didn't involve charismatic species like dinosaurs. But we can look at it qualitatively, as at the bottom left, where we have a before and after. We have a scene of rich seabed life, a reef. We have hundreds of species. We have rock building up with broken shells and bits of that reef. And then after, at the very beginning of the Triassic, after the crisis. We have very few species, half a dozen. The reef has gone. The rock is just bland, black mudstone. There's very little evidence of life. And it can be documented numerically as well, as shown at the top right, which is a diagram showing the track record of 500 species of marine organisms. And this highlights that there were a couple of pulses of extinction, one in the latest Permian, one in the earliest Triassic. So, and separated not by a few thousand years, in fact, maybe 60,000. So again, this extraordinary quality of dating that's now possible. And this is highlighting that this is a wee bit more complex than we had thought. There may be several pulses of extinction which together make a really big crisis, whereas at the end of the Cretaceous, maybe only 50% of species died out. Here at the end of the Permian, it was more like 90 or 95%. So this was the biggest of all time, really, really serious. And qualitatively, the before and the after is seen on land too. That life on land, as shown at the right, was complex with all kinds of weird and wonderful creatures. And then after the event, very little, just one or two species, and very bland, very boring worldwide. The complexity, the endemism, all of the features of life before are kind of lost, and a few stragglers get through. And this is to give you a little flavor of the sort of field work. We were working in Russia in rather happier days when it was possible to do that. And the reason being that they've got some of the very best documentation of this event. The map shows Moscow up towards the left, and the width of this basin, the rock is highlighted in color, is about 1,000 kilometers, 700 miles. And we're working from pretty much the modern Arctic Circle in the north, Arkhangelsk, down to the Ural River and rather hot conditions around Kazakhstan. And we're ranging all over this. Here's Perm, the origin of the name Permian. And all the Permian is in pink, and the Triassic is in red, so that, in blue, I should say. So there's lots of locations where we could look at the boundary. And here we are in the south, walking up to the boundary. And I've marked the Permian-Triassic boundary there, right in that rock succession. Here we are looking at it directly with our noses at it. There's a big, big transition in the types of rock. In the Permian, it's mudstones and sandstones indicating deposition by rivers. This is a terrestrial deposit. And at the very beginning of the Triassic is this conglomerate, which is made up of boulders and large pieces of rock, indicating high energy, rapid transport, sort of something catastrophic. So what's going on? And just while we were doing these studies, other people independently were doing similar work in South Africa, where there are similarly excellent rock successions, and they found the same river transition shown in one of their block diagrams. So lovely meandering streams in the late Permian, indicating lazy, sluggish movement of water, gentle conditions, transitioning into braided streams and alluvial fans at the top, which indicates rapid erosion, transport of huge amounts of sediment and rapid deposition, high energy. And this could be local tectonics, meaning the mountains are being uplifted somehow, you're tilting them and you're getting more sediment running down, or increased rainfall, which would wash off a lot more sediment than before, or what we came to in the end, which we're pretty sure is the true interpretation, is loss of vegetation. And we're beginning to put together the model of crisis driven by volcano. And the reason for loss of vegetation is that if this is a worldwide phenomenon, it cannot be local tectonics. All the evidence from these sections around the world is for increasing aridity, not increasing rainfall. And the loss of vegetation had already been noted by others. They had noticed that commercially, if you're working the coal deposits in China and South America, Brazil, other parts of the world, there are rich coal deposits of Upper Permian age, and they stop. And that was called the coal gap in the early Triassic. No coal, meaning no plants or limited amount of plants. And so we interpret this as evidence of acid rain and mass wasting, which means that acid rain was killing the forests as it can do today. But this was worldwide at the end of the Permian. And the coal gap was that lack of preservation. And the sediment wash into the sea happens a year or two after. If you kill the forests, they die and the roots eventually loosen. And with further rainfall and gravity, all of that soil and plant material gets washed into the ocean. It's happening today. It's happening in the Amazon. It's happening in India. It's happening in other tropical countries where people are cutting down the forests. And oh, my phone is ringing. I hope my wife will pick it up in a moment. So I'll carry on. The Siberian traps are volcanic rocks that were erupted at that time in Russia, huge volumes, and they are the smoking gun. They are driving this whole process. So let me weave this together. How do we get acid rain and massive removal of sediment from the land from volcanic eruptions? Here it is. It's a fairly complex diagram. It's a very important one, though, that if you're teaching this or talking about it, it's a very useful diagram that's in the talk, which you can pick up later, and in the book as well. So starting at the top, the Siberian traps eruption, so just massive volcanic eruption. We're not focusing on the lava, excuse me, because the lava will only have a local or regional effect. It's the gases, the sulfur dioxide, the carbon dioxide, the methane. And those three are what drive the acid rain and the warming. First of all, the sulfur dioxide mixing with water and oxygen in the air gives you acid rain, because obviously sulfuric acid is battery acid. That is a killer. And the acid rain on the far left kills life on land. It causes soil erosion, leads to the terrestrial mass extinction, but it also disturbs the landscapes, leading to siltation and the washing of sediment into the ocean. It also acidifies the ocean. So we're getting acidification of the ocean, which we know today kills marine organisms, which rely on non-acid seawater, because of course their shells are often made of calcium carbonate. And the CO2 and the methane, they give you warming, leading to global warming, which coupled with the acid rain kills, because many organisms on land cannot stand warming. So particularly in the tropical belt, plants and animals would be baked, and they would rapidly move out of those latitudes. And then you get crowding of life from the tropics into the temperate and polar areas. In the oceans, you'll get direct killing through swamping of the shallow marine waters by siltation and by excessive amounts of nutrients being washed into the oceans. That will lead to anoxia, loss of oxygen on the seabed, and that's coupled with the warming, because the warming will drive the thermocline down, and the normal circulation of water in the ocean is stopped. Because normally, of course, deep water in the oceans comes to the surface where it picks up oxygen, and then it passes down, it circles back down to the seabed, because organisms on the seabed need the oxygen. But if you stop that and you add to the cocktail acidification, everything dies. So, and we have evidence for that from isotopes. So on the right is indication of the PT boundary, the Permian Triassic boundary at 252 is at the bottom. These are carbon dioxide and strontium measurements, and they indicate repeated episodes of extreme warming, both at the boundary, so that peak at the boundary, and then a million years later in the Induan, and then again another million or a couple of million years later, several cycles of warming, all the way through the early Triassic. So maybe 5 or 6 million years of really perturbed atmospheres and oceans with repeated high temperatures. How high? Plus 15 degrees C. So that means tropical oceans at 25 go up to 40. And I think we all know that life cannot tolerate temperatures of 35 or 40. And corollary evidence from the early Triassic is, in fact, the tropical dead zone. So shown in that paleogeographic map, both in the shallow seas and on land, life has gone. There are very few fossils. Life has disappeared, it's moved away. But what about recovery? Because I think this will be my last section. I'll just wrap it up in a moment. Mass extinctions they offer creativity in the sense of opportunity. Let me just develop that idea. So what happened after that catastrophic extinction at the end of the Permian, when only 5% of life survived? And remember, we have evidence at that time of really grim conditions. It wasn't just a quick event. So impact is quick. And so life recovered after the End-Cretaceous event quite quickly, after a matter of years, or maybe a few tens of years. But this was prolonged at the end of the Permian. This was awful conditions for 5 or 6 million years. It took a long time for life to recover, but my goodness, how it recovered. And so here is a diagram showing the diversification of fishes, just as one example. And they just diversify like mad. And somehow the extinction gave them all an opportunity. So it's what we sometimes call ecological release. Even though the few survivors in the early Triassic were probably a pretty miserable bunch, and conditions were horrible. As soon as those conditions ameliorated and got better, they exploded and all kinds of new kinds of fishes appeared. And I'm showing a flying fish here just to remind me to say that kind of ecological diversification. You got kinds of fishes that had never been seen before. So within 10 million years of the extinction, life was burgeoning, and new types of life that now shape the ecosystems today. And not only fishes and other animals, but also plants. So if you look at the history of plants, we're now scaling this differently. We're looking at 500 million years. Here's the PT event. This marks the boundary between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, just as the End-Cretaceous event that we looked at before marks the boundary between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. And you can see in the history of plants, highlighted in the different colors, these blobs of color, indicating that the End-Permian event gave the opportunity for conifers and cycads and a whole bunch of new types of plants to diversify, just as the End-Cretaceous event gave the opportunity for the angiosperms, the flowering plants, to really take over. In both cases, the new groups were already there, and they'd already established themselves very well, as you can see, but they really hadn't taken over in a big way. And so there was another aspect of the creativity. And when we think of forests and plants today, we're thinking of angiosperms, flowering plants, almost all the trees, grasses. Those plants that dominate the landscape today are angiosperms. And to a large extent, they owe their success to the End-Cretaceous extinction event, just as the conifers owe their success to the End-Permian mass extinction. And likewise, modern ecosystems were triggered by the End-Permian mass extinction. So for those of you who know about fossils, all of these groups, the Paleozoic and Cambrian faunas, trilobites and ammonoids, crinoids, various kinds of corals and so on, they all went extinct at the end of the Permian, 252, not 245. And they were replaced by modern types of animals, like modern types of sharks and insects and mollusks and vertebrates, etc., etc. So again, there was that opportunity to diversify that came as a result of the extinction. But that's not a reason for us to be hopeful, of course, about the modern extinctions that are happening. Yes, no doubt, when the pressure of the carbon dioxide and global warming and other things are relieved, new forms of life will doubtless replace, but this actually takes millions of years, and very possibly human beings may not be there. I'm just going to skim through the next little bit because I think time is pressing and I'd like to wrap up in a moment. But all I'll say about this story, so this is another chapter of the book, is there were a number of so-called ocean anoxic events, OAE. Because remember, part of the effect of volcanic eruptions in causing extinction in the oceans is anoxia, the removal of oxygen from deep waters, which can happen when the oceans are perturbed by changing thermoclines due to warming conditions, by acidification, and also in the case of these ocean anoxic events, and I do apologize for pinging through these, another effect that can happen is euxinia. And this is a process of excessive sulfur. So in the modern Black Sea, which to the ancient Greeks was called the Euxinic Ocean, which means something like the happy life ocean, which is ironic because actually euxinic conditions with excessive amounts of sulfur are not very friendly to life. And on the ocean floor, euxinia can be associated with lack of oxygen and the formation of pyrite, iron sulfide, FeS, and the high sulfur conditions in the Black Sea, and maybe in these ocean anoxic events, would rise almost to the surface. There's a total breakdown in the normal circulation of oxygen and carbon, and this can be caused by volcanic eruptions, by the lowering of the thermocline, by heating of the air and the surface, and by the stoppage of circulation, and that sulfur can even bubble up through the surface, causing death and destruction. And so all of this weaves together, this is my final point, into what we now call the universal hypothermal model. So if you teach extinctions or the history of life or any of these topics, it's worth having a look at the UHM, the Universal Hypothermal Model. It means hyperthermal means high temperature, so it's a perfect name. And the model I showed you for the End-Permian, which was the biggest of these hyperthermals, we now realize it actually applies to about 15 or 16 crises in the history of life. And so this now begins to show us maybe there's something repeatable, there's something we can look at that refers to the present day, but we can look back into the past. The one exception is the End-Cretaceous. That was impact. That's different. That's cooling, that's quick. It kills dinosaurs, it kills stuff, but it's very different from the hypothermal model, which is an earthbound process, doesn't involve any intervention, any extraterrestrial intervention. And I remind you of this graph that I showed at the start, highlighting the big five. So I've now marked the End-Cretaceous as impact, so there's a little asteroid there, but all of those others shown with red arrows are hyperthermals, including some of the smaller events. So running through here from 250 to the present day, there are these ocean anoxic events. And there's a bunch of others. So altogether, maybe 15 or so, all the way through time, ranging in size. So the interesting thing is this now gives us a kind of shopping list of events in the past that all share a single causative model, linking from Earth to life, linking from volcanic eruption to killing life. And more or less, the bigger the volcanic effect, the bigger the volcanic eruption, the bigger the temperature rise, the bigger the killing. So the End-Permian was the biggest of all. It's got the biggest killing, way over 50%, much higher than that, 90% plus. And it has the biggest temperature rise, 15 degrees, plus 15. So plus 15 gives you 90% extinction. Whereas at the end of the Triassic or the end of the Devonian, it's maybe plus 8 or 10, and that gives you 50% killing. And some of the smaller events are maybe extinction events of maybe 10 or 20%, and they're associated with temperature rises of maybe 2 or 3 degrees. And there is a more recent one, the PETM, 56 million years ago. It's been studied in exhaustive detail. Really huge amounts of information are known about this, and the quality of the data is fantastic. Because broadly speaking, the nearer you get to the present day, the better the quality of the dating, the more localities you can look at, and the greater the opportunities to test these kinds of hypotheses. And you can look at the time scale there in millions of years. It's fractions of millions of years that can be done. So here is the universal hyperthermal model in a different form, showing the volcano, showing the SO2 emissions and the CO2, the thermogenic methane, the acid rain, the plant death, the soil erosion, food chain collapse, terrestrial mass extinction, algal blooms and ocean anoxia. And in there somewhere we have Euxinia and we have marine mass extinction. So there we are, that's that. Oh, and I think I'll hurry through this. Forgive me, I've got far too much. How do high temperatures kill? They do just kill through a variety of mechanisms, and mainly through heat stress. So most plants and animals have got very exact temperature requirements. And there are very few modern plants and animals that are happy above 30 degrees C. And above 35, they are distinctly twitchy. And up to 40, they just die. And I know that sounds extreme because 40 degrees is a hot shower. And you might think, well, that's lovely. We'd like to live in those conditions all the time. But actually, if you leave your hot shower running for more than a few minutes at 40 degrees, you're going to be boiled. You're going to hate it. And no animal or plant likes those conditions. And added to the fact that the temperature kills, it increases heat stress in terms of the requirement for oxygen and all sorts of other stuff. So there's the unhappy pig sitting in his shed at 40 degrees. He's going to die. So heat is the killer, all sorts of consequences of heat listed there, excessive carbon dioxide, acidification, acid rain, all kinds of other linked features, but these are all consequences of the hypothermal model. And so I think the key messages are that in the last 30 years, the quality of geologic and paleontologic data has improved massively, and we can test hypotheses about these past extinction crises. And I've given you a couple of examples that make really nice case studies for school kids of almost any age. You know, you can challenge them and say, we know that dinosaurs died in June. And they say, oh, come on, don't speak nonsense. And I think you can talk them through pretty much from the age of 7 or 8 and explain about the growth rings and how you calculate that. Look at the modern examples. Wow, yeah, we know that. We know that. That's amazing. And this knowledge can inform our understanding of modern extinction crisis. Of course, there is a positive aspect, which I develop in the book, which is a really big principle of macroevolution, big evolution. How do we get the biodiversity that we've got today? Why are certain groups like birds and mammals prevalent and the flowering plants? Why not something else? So you can kind of ask those questions about biodiversity today. Why is it structured in the way that it is? And then you can look back to these events in the past. And then the fourth point is about the universal hypothermal model of extinction. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I think it's a really important concept that really draws together what maybe 10 years ago we would have seen as a lot of disparate, scattered bits and pieces of information, when each of these 15 crises was treated as separate. And they are separate in terms of causes and consequences, but the general model shares a lot. And I think that's really quite exciting. So there we are. If you're interested, the book is out. It's been out for a month, and I tell you a lot more about these things in the book. And I can't resist mentioning, if you like dinosaurs and other stuff, I've done similar books which are taken from the point of view of, let's get you right into the laboratory, standing behind the young scientists who are doing this fantastic work. And how do we really know this stuff? And so it's very much geared at answering questions from inquiring people. So thank you very much. I'll stop at that, and I will stop sharing and hand back to Kenny. And thank you so much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Benton. You have a couple of questions which I'll read to you.
Thank you.
When you're showing the picture of that young scientist with the pink hair, Katrina said, I try to teach my students that scientists look like all different types of people. Thank you for doing the same. My class all looked over at me when you mentioned the faces of the scientists in your slides.
Great, thank you for that.
And Bertha, the director of TIES, says, I love your enthusiasm. Science is about questions and evidence, and the answers are so exciting.
And I can respond, thank you. And yes, I think it's great to be able to give students a case study where you can actually reveal the evidence. You're not saying, oh, this is very complex, we have a big machine and it kind of gives us the answer. I think you can explain this stuff at levels that people think, wow, yeah, I could do that. You know, I could do that and I guess we use the image of the CSI, the detective work. You know, you've got a clue and another clue and another clue, and you know, that sort of thing really works very nicely with this kind of story.
Michelle asks, what is your philosophical thoughts on observing the modern extinction event?
Yes, and I see another point from Katrina. Oh yeah, no, from Bertha. How do you teach this without creating despair? I don't know the answer to that because, of course, no human being has got a correct view about all of this, the state of the world. We do our best and we all have our opinions. We focus on what we know, what we can observe. And it is difficult. I guess you have to give the examples. I think we do have to evaluate the evidence. So I've given you an argument to say, hold on, maybe not 80 species per day, maybe lower. This is not, although that argument is not against Gore, is not against the general consensus, of course, that we will hear from Attenborough, we hear from Gore, we hear from all kinds of people who do know their stuff. But it's also putting a case to say we need to investigate, you know, we need to look in detail. And actually, to be told that despite all the effort, we've not yet got a complete roster of all the species on Earth. It's a fact. If there are 10 million species, we've only named 1.5 million. By we, I mean all humanity in the last 200 years has only named 1.5 million species, which is a huge number, but it's still not enough. And there's still another 8.5 million to be named. So in a way that gives hope for a young person to think, well, yeah, I'd love to pursue this. You know, I want to work in one of these great museums or go on expeditions around the world and really get to grips with understanding biodiversity. But also we don't know the number of extinctions because, of course, when you discuss this with students and ask them, well, how could we know? We can sort of know about the mammals and the birds and the big things that we care about because we see them and we can recognize the species. And lots of the extinctions were happening kind of in our backyard. But when it comes to something like flies or beetles, most people, including me, I haven't got a clue. I can't identify species of insects. I've got no idea. And yet they're there, they're real species. And you know, people will see a bee wandering about and they'll think, oh, there's a bee and there's another bee and there's another bee. But an expert in bees will say, that's 3 different species. Don't you know that? So, you know, it's difficult for us to observe, but we can use commonplace examples to encourage people to understand. And of course, these are the kinds of studies that we have to do. So I suppose I'd turn it to the positive to say, yeah, you know, this is terrible, but we need to go out there and engage and engage with the knowledge and engage with the stuff and provide information, provide data so that people can appreciate biodiversity and care about it.
All right, your publisher generously donated several copies, 2 of which are going to 2 lucky teachers who attended this live, and the rest of them are going to our conferences that we do state by state. And today's lucky winners are Michelle Drucker and Kelly Dawson, so you'll be receiving a copy each. And I'll end with another comment. I wish we had this book in college. I am glad for the new generations who can read it simultaneously with their ecology courses.
Perfect, thank you. Yes.
And thank you everyone who attended this live. We're taking off December and we'll be back in January. All right, thank you, Dr. Benton.
My pleasure, great to meet you all, and let's look forward to the next time.